October 1944. Somewhere outside the harbor of New York. The cargo ship had been silent for most of the night. Not because the men inside were sleeping. Because no one wanted to speak. Hundreds of German prisoners sat on the steel floor of the transport hold, their backs against wooden crates and their knees pulled to their chests. For 2 weeks, they had crossed the Atlantic as prisoners of war. No one knew where they were going. Some believed Canada. Others whispered about prison camps in the American desert. But what troubled them most was something none of them expected. The lights. Not inside the ship. Outside. Through a narrow opening above the hatch, a pale glow had appeared on the horizon hours earlier. At first, the prisoners thought it was sunrise. But the glow grew brighter and brighter until it filled the sky. Jeffrater Karl Brenner noticed it first. He had been a mechanic before the war, working in a small engine factory outside Stuttgart. He stared through the opening, confused. It was still the middle of the night. Yet the entire horizon looked as if the sun were rising. One of the prisoners whispered quietly, "Bombing fires." Another shook his head. "No, too steady." Then the ship slowly turned. And suddenly they saw it. An endless wall of light. Miles of illuminated buildings. Rows of cranes towering over the harbor. Ships moving through the water like shadows beneath electric suns. For a long moment, no one said anything. Because the sight made no sense. In Germany, the cities had been dark for years. Blackout curtains. Street lamps turned off. Factories operating behind shielded windows. Even Berlin rarely looked bright at night anymore. But here, the entire coastline glowed like a festival. And it was still 3 in the morning. When the prisoners were finally marched onto the dock at dawn, the first shock arrived immediately. Noise. Everywhere. Metal clanging. Engines roaring. Sirens calling. Forklifts carrying crates across the concrete docks. Karl Brenner had worked in factories before. But nothing like this. The port seemed endless. Cargo ships lined the harbor in every direction. Cranes swung heavy loads through the air with mechanical precision. Train cars rolled in and out of loading stations. And workers moved quickly between them all. What confused the prisoners most was the workers themselves. They were calm, unhurried. Some laughed as they worked. One man even stopped to light a cigarette while an enormous steel crate swung over his head. Karl stared. In Germany, a single shipment arriving at a factory could halt operations for hours. Here it looked like hundreds were moving at once. A German officer quietly muttered beside him, "This must be their largest port." An American guard overheard. He smiled slightly. "No." He pointed across the harbor. "Not even close." The prisoners were loaded onto trains later that morning. But these were not the kind they expected. Not freight wagons. Not cattle cars. Passenger coaches. Soft seats. Glass windows. Overhead luggage racks. For a moment, the prisoners hesitated before entering. Karl Brenner ran his hand across the fabric of the seat as he sat down. It was cleaner than the train he had taken to join the army. The train began moving slowly. As it left the city, the prisoners pressed against the windows. The industrial zones appeared first. Factories stretched across the horizon. Some were so large that the train took several minutes to pass them. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Assembly lines could be seen through wide windows. And the parking lots outside were filled with automobiles. Hundreds of them. Carl counted silently. In his village, only the mayor owned a car. Here it looked like factory workers drove them. The train continued west. The factories never seemed to end. Steel plants, chemical refineries, shipyards, machine workshops. Some were so large they looked like small cities. And most of them were still operating, even in the afternoon, even as the war continued overseas. By the second day of travel, the prisoners had stopped speaking about victory. Instead, they whispered about numbers. How many factories had they seen? How many trains had passed them? How many trucks were moving along the highways? One prisoner tried to calculate how many aircraft engines a factory that size could produce. Another estimated the steel output of a mill they had passed. The conclusions were always the same. Germany could not match it. Not even close. But the most unsettling moment came late that evening. The train slowed as it passed through a rural farming region. Carl expected quiet countryside, small farms, wooden houses. Instead, he saw tractors working fields under electric lights, machines harvesting crops long after sunset, grain silos taller than church towers, and long lines of trucks waiting to transport the harvest. A farmer stood beside one of the machines drinking coffee from a metal cup. He looked relaxed, not like someone struggling through wartime shortages. Carl turned to another prisoner. How many people live here? The prisoner shrugged. Not many. Carl stared back out the window. The farm itself was larger than his entire village. When they finally arrived at the camp in the American Midwest, exhaustion had replaced curiosity. But the surprises continued. The camp had electricity, running water, hot showers. The barracks were heated, and the kitchen produced food that looked nothing like wartime rations. Carl stood in line, holding his metal tray. The cook placed potatoes, vegetables, bread, and meat onto it. Real meat, not the thin soup they had eaten during the last months in Europe. Carl sat down slowly and looked at the plate. Across from him, another prisoner whispered, "Maybe they are trying to impress us." Carl shook his head. No. He looked around the dining hall. American guards were eating the same meal. At another table, a worker casually threw away half a loaf of bread. Not because it was spoiled, simply because there was more. Carl suddenly understood something that had been bothering him since the harbor. None of this looked unusual to the Americans. The lights, the factories, the machines, the food. To them, it was normal. Months passed. Some prisoners were sent to work on farms. Others helped repair roads and rail lines. Carl was assigned to a machinery repair shop. There he saw something that changed his understanding of the war completely. Birds, thousands of them. Engines, bearings, gears, electrical components, all organized on shelves. If something broke, the replacement arrived within hours. In Germany, a missing part could shut down a machine for weeks. Here, the mechanic simply walked to a shelf and grabbed another. Carl asked the shop owner where all the parts came from. The man shrugged casually. Factories. Carl pressed further. Which factories? The mechanic laughed. Hard to say, probably dozens. That was the moment Carl realized something terrifying. The war was not being fought only on battlefields. It was being fought in workshops, in steel mills, in fields, In shipyards and in those places, America was producing faster than anyone could destroy. By the spring of 1945, the prisoners were receiving newspapers. The headlines confirmed what many of them had already suspected. German cities were collapsing. Factories were running out of materials. Fuel shortages were crippling transportation. Karl folded the newspaper quietly. He looked around the barracks. Hundreds of men sat silently, thinking the same thing. They had crossed an ocean to fight a war. But the outcome had been decided somewhere else. In the factories they had seen through train windows. In the farms that stretched to the horizon. In the endless lights that had first appeared on the horizon that night at sea. Years later, Karl Brenner returned to Germany. The country lay in ruins. Factories destroyed. Cities reduced to rubble. But something else remained. A memory, not of defeat, but of a discovery. He had seen a nation where machines worked day and night, where workers drove their own cars, where farms produced more food than entire provinces, and where factories seemed limitless. Karl eventually opened a small mechanical workshop during the rebuilding years. On the wall above his desk, he hung a photograph, not of the war, not of his army unit, but of a factory assembly line he had seen in America. Whenever someone asked why he kept it there, Karl would simply say, "Because that is where the war was really won."